Hi everyone! We'll be looking at the 28 Days Later franchise, how it differs from other zombie films and why it's more than just an apocalypse movie. Enjoy everyone and let's get started. In 2002, a film was released that completely reinvented the zombie horror genre. Not The Walking Dead, not World War Z, it was 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle. The film introduced something new to the genre, zombies that run. But more importantly, it made the apocalypse feel raw, realistic and psychological. And it asked a disturbing question. What is more dangerous, the virus or people? Today, we will examine the entire franchise. 28 days later, 28 weeks later, 28 years later, and 28 years later, the Bond Table. And we'll try to understand why this story is about much more than a zombie outbreak.
How it all began. 28 days later. The story begins with an animal rights raid on a laboratory.
Activists break into a research facility and release laboratory chimpanzees. However, they don't know one critical detail. The animals are infected with the rage virus. The virus spreads extremely fast. With 20 seconds after infections, a person turned into a violently aggressive creature. The main character. The protagonist is a bicycle courier named Jim, played by Cillian Murphy. After a serious accident, he wakes up in a hospital 28 days later. But the world he is new is gone. London is completely empty. No people, no traffic, no electricity. One of the most iconic scenes in horror cinema shows Jim walking through an abandoned London at sunrise. What makes the film different? The first, the infected are not traditional zombies. They are not undead, they are still alive but infected, and they run. This film popularized the idea of the fast infected creatures, which later became common in modern zombie stories. The second, realism. The movie was shot using digital cameras, giving it a raw and documentary-like look. The apocalypses feel uncomfortably real. The third, human became the real violence. When the survivors finally reach a military base, they discover something terrifying. The soldiers are not planning to save them. Instead, they intend to use the woman to rebuild civilization. This moment reveals the core idea of the film. The apocalypse does not create monster, it simply reveals who people really are. 5 years later, the story continues in 28 weeks later, directed by Junior Carlos Fresnadillo. The story. 28 weeks after the outbreak, the virus appears to have been eradicated. The United Kingdom is slowly being repopulated. A safe zone in London is controlled by international forces and the military. However, everything collapses because of one mistake. A woman who carries a genetic immunity to the virus infects her husband. The outbreak begins again. What makes this film different? If the first film is an intimate survival story, the second is a large-scale disaster movie. We see military operations, evacuations attempts, the complete collapse of the quarantine zone. One of the most disturbing moments occurs when soldiers receive orders to shoot everyone because it becomes impossible to distinguish infected from healthy civilians. Central theme. The film explores the fear of losing control. Authorities decide that the only way to stop the virus is to destroy everything, even innocent people. Once again, the film asks the same questions. What is more dangerous, the infections or human decisions? A new stage for the franchise. The film 28 years later is not just a continuation of the story after 28 weeks later. It represents a completely new stage of the franchise because almost 3 decades have passed since the original outbreak. The first two films focused on the beginning of the epidemic, the failed attempt to rebuild civilization, but the new film explores a world that has been living with the consequences of the apocalypse for decades. This shifts the story from a disaster narrative to a new reality shaped by the collapse of civilization. A world decades after collapse. In the early films, people still remembered the old world, governments, organized armies, modern society. In 28 years later, a new generation has grown up without ever experiencing that world. For them, ruined cities, abandoned infrastructure, infected creatures are simply part of everyday life. This makes the story feel more like a post-apocalyptic saga rather than a traditional zombie horror film. Evolution of the infected. In the early films, infected individuals were simply humans carrying the Reich virus. But after decades, things may have changed. The new film suggests the possibility that infected creatures may have adapted to the environment, some may have survived longer than expected, the virus itself may have evolved. This introduced a new uncertainty because the world no longer follows the same rules as before. A large world. 28 days later was very intimate, a small group of survivors trying to stay alive. 28 weeks later expanded the scale with military operations and quarantine zone. But 28 years later may show a much broader world, including new settlements, isolated survivors communities, different strategies for rebuilding society. The universe of the franchise becomes large and more complex. Return of the original creators. Another important difference is the return of the original creative team. Directed Danny Boyle, writer Alex Harlan. These are the same creators who made 20 Days Later so influential. Their return may bring back the same raw atmosphere and realism that defined the original film. Beginning of a new trilogy. 28 years later is planned as the first film of new trilogy. Future entries will continue to expand the world. One of them is 28 years later, The Bone Temple, which explores new beliefs system and cults that emerge in the post-apocalyptic world. Continuing the story after 28 years later. The film 28 years later, The Bone Temple is the fourth installment of the franchise following the events of 28 days later, 28 weeks later, 28 years later. The story takes place in a world that has been living with the consequences of the rage virus outbreak for almost 3 decades. Britain remains an isolated territory where civilization has mostly collapsed and the survivors live in small communities. Spike's story. The central character of the film is Spike, a teenager who survived the events of the previous film. He travels through the devastated territories of Britain and encounters not only infected creatures but also different groups of survivors who have created their own rules for living in the post-apocalyptic world. Through his journey, the audience sees how dramatically the world has changed over the decades. Sir Jimmy Crystal. During his travels, Spikes encounters a group led by a charismatic leader known as Sir Jimmy Crystal, portrayed by Jack O'Connell. This community controls part of the territory and lives under strict rules. At first, it appears to be a safe place, but Spike gradually realizes that power and control in this world can be just as dangerous as the infected themselves. Dr. Kelson. Another important character is Dr. Kelson, played by Ralph Fiennes. He studies the Rage virus and tries to understand how the world and the infection have evolved over time. Kelson discovers evidence suggesting that some infected may have changed after decades of the outbreak. This discovery challenges everything people previously believed about the virus. What the Bone Temple is. The title refers to a place created by Dr. Kelson. The Bone Temple is a memorial structure built from the bones and remains of those who died during the epidemic. It symbolizes The scale of humanity tragedy, remembrance of the old world, and the attempt to understand life after the apocalypse. The fates of the main characters eventually converge around this location. The main idea of the film. Unlike the early films in the franchise, the Bone Temple focus more on humanity society than on the infected themselves. The film explores how humanity has changed after decades of fear, how new communities and leaders emerge, and how people search for meaning in a ruined world. As a result, the story becomes not only a horror film but also a psychological exploration of humanity's future. Why the 28 franchise is more than a zombie story. The first, it is about human rage. The rage virus is essentially a metaphor for human aggression. The films show how quickly civilization can collapse when people act only on fear and anger. The second, it is about morality. Characters constantly face difficult choices, save themselves or help others, and often humanity fails this moral test. The third, realism. Unlike many traditional zombie movies, these films avoid heroic cliches. There are no superheroes, no perfect solutions, no easy answer, only people trying to survive in the world without rules. I am sure you enjoyed the video and Slav Nema was with you. See you soon!